Number 10. The knee splitter. The knee splitter was used to sever knees as well as other limbs. This device was a lot less deadly than some of its counterparts, but definitely just as painful. It was similar to a vice and had spikes on both sides. The torturer would turn the handle, and as the vice squeezed against the victim, the spikes would drive into their flesh, causing immense pain. The goal of the torture was rarely death when it came to the knee splitter, as there were better torture devices for that. However, the device would mangle limbs and leave joints virtually useless. There were many variations of this device, as spikes ranged in number from 3 up to 20. To maximize pain and agony, spikes were sometimes heated beforehand. Wow, that sounds pleasant. Number 9. The head crusher. The Spanish Inquisition was one of the deadliest times in history, and the torture tool of choice at the time was the head crusher. The device worked by placing the victim's chin on top of a bottom bar and then the top of their head underneath the cap. Slowly, the torturer would turn a lever, compressing the victim's skull with each turn. Eventually, the teeth and then the jaw would be shattered, and eventually, after a hellish period of time, the victim would eventually die. Because of how slow this torture was, it was perfect for getting confessions out of people. Number 8. Saw torture. The saw torture was one of the simplest devices used during the Middle Ages. It was just a common house saw that was cheap and easy to find. Victims would be tied upside down so that all the blood would rush to their brain, making it much harder for them to pass out. This made sure they were in as much pain as possible for as long as possible. Sometimes the torture would even last several hours, as this also slowed blood loss. It was used on people accused of witchcraft, murder, and adultery, or sometimes even something as little as theft. Most of the time, they were only cut up to their abdomen, so that they would take longer to die, but occasionally they would be cut clean in half. Number 7. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel was designed to kill the victim every time it was used, but also to inflict as much pain as possible in the process. This torture was meant to be agonizingly slow to prevent the victim from having a quick and easy death. Limbs of the victim were tied to a giant wooden wheel, which was then slowly spun as the torturer smashed the limbs of the victim with a large hammer on every rotation. Then, after their limbs were broken in many places, they would be left on the wheel to die. At times, the wheel would be placed on a large pole and birds would literally eat the victim alive. Usually they would die of dehydration after a horrendous 2 or 3 days. If the torturers were feeling merciful, they would just deliver a life-ending blow to the chest or stomach to put the victim out of their misery. This became known as the blow of mercy. Number 6. The PEAR of Anguish. This torture device's name was taken from its pear-like shape. Its intended purpose was to rip orifices and dislocate jawbones. Although the PEAR of Anguish is smaller than most of its counterparts, it still packed quite an evil punch. The wicked instrument was used on women who performed abortions, liars, blasphemers, as well as homosexuals. It worked by being inserted into one of the orifices of the accused, generally the vagina for women, the anus for homosexuals, and the mouth for liars and blasphemers. The torturer would then turn a screw at the top, which then slowly expanded the 4 sides outwards. The PEAR would stretch out the victim's orifice as it tore the skin and muscle of the victim. As if this wasn't bad enough, since the device didn't generally cause death, it was usually followed by other torture methods. Number 5. The breast ripper. The breast ripper, as you might expect by the name, was a torture device designed specifically for women. Its purpose was to mutilate and inflict as much pain as possible and blood loss to the woman's breasts. It worked by placing boiling hot claws on a woman's bare chest. The claws were sharp and the spikes would penetrate the woman's skin, grasping tightly to her flesh. Then the torturer would pull at the device and the woman's breasts would be ripped to pieces. If she didn't die from blood loss or infection, the woman would be horribly mutilated for the rest of her life. One of the more horrendous variations of this device was called the spider. In this, a breast ripper would be attached to a wall and the woman's breasts put in it. Then the torturer would pull the woman away from the wall, often ripping her breasts off in the process. This brutal punishment was usually reserved for a woman accused of adultery or performing abortions. Number 4. The rack. Designed with one purpose in mind, the rack was intended to dislocate every joint in the body of its victims. This may well be the most feared torture device in the history of the world. The rack was made out of a wooden frame with 2 ropes tied to the bottom, as well as 2 ropes tied to the handle at the top. As the handle was turned, the ropes would get tighter and tighter, pulling at the victim's arms. As the turning continued, bones would break and joints would dislocate. At times, the limbs were stretched so far that they would be ripped straight off the victim's body. You might have thought the rack was bad as it is, but the torturers of the Middle Ages thought differently. On top of this already horrid machine, they added a new feature: spikes. Penetrating the victim's back as they were forced on the table, spikes made it so the spinal cord was ripped apart as the limbs were being stretched also. Number 3. Coffin torture. Coffin torture. The name says it all. Victims would be placed alive and unharmed in a metal cage the size and shape of a human body. The cage was then hung from a gallows or a tree, often in a place open to the public for everyone to see. Heresy and blasphemy were considered some of the most serious crimes and were punished by death in the coffin. This meant that victims would be placed inside the cage, under the hot sun, as birds and other animals would eat their flesh. Along with the animals, onlookers and passerbys were welcome to throw rocks or other objects to increase the pain the victim felt. Overweight victims had it the worst, as they were forced into a cage too small for them. For anyone with claustrophobia, this is probably the worst way to die. Number 2. Judas Cradle. Similar to Impalement, the Judas Cradle was only slightly less ruthless, yet still extremely horrifying. The torture involved tying the victim to ropes and lowering them onto a triangle-shaped object so that the sharp point of the triangle would be inserted into them through their anus or vagina. The victim's orifice would be ripped as it was stretched over the point. The idea was that the victim's weight pushed them further down, so they would slowly impale themselves. If it were taking too long, sometimes weights would be added to the victim's legs to speed things up and make them die faster. However, it could take full days for the victim to die in this excruciating death. Adding to the gruesomeness, the device would not be washed between murders, so victims could often contract painful infections along the way. As you can imagine, the Judas Cradle could be horribly painful. Then again, I guess that was the point. Number 1. Impalement. Impalement was made famous by none other than Dracula himself. However, not Dracula the vampire you might be familiar with. This Dracula lived in Romania during the 15th century and went by the name Vlad the Impaler. With a name like that, you can bet he was one scary dude. Impalement involved having the victim sit on a thick, sharp pole before raising it with the victim still on it. The pressure of their body weight would drive the giant stake through their body, all while they were still alive. Victims would sometimes be alive on the stake for 3 days before they would eventually die. Some estimates say that Vlad killed as many as 300,000 people using his favorite method. Other historians claimed he could often be found enjoying a meal and spectating as a victim was being impaled. I don't know about you, but unlike Vlad, I prefer my dinnertime entertainment with a little less murder.